Before we raise the curtain on this terrifying opera of crime, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single thread we pull. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and listen closely. We present to you the Sinister Symphonies. The rain fell on the city of Crestwood like a mournful dirge, a steady, percussive rhythm against the tall glass panes of the high-rise apartment. Inside, the silence was of a different, more profound kind. It was the absolute, vacuum-sealed silence that follows the final, violent exhalation of a life. This was the canvas upon which Detective Isabella Rossi and her partner, Detective Marcus Thorne, began to paint their grim picture. The victim was Albert Finch, a man whose pen was arguably more feared than any blade in the city. As the chief classical music critic for the Crestwood Chronicle, Finch's reviews could elevate a musician to stardom or shatter a career into 1,000 discordant pieces. Now, he lay sprawled on an opulent white chaise lounge, his eyes wide with a final, unseeing terror. He was dressed in the impeccable tuxedo he wore to the symphony just hours earlier, but a grotesque addition marred the ensemble. A single, blood-red rose was clutched in his stiffening hand, and a thin, crimson line, as neat as a surgical incision, smiled across his throat. The scene was theatrical, deliberate, and utterly chilling. Staged, every bit of it, Thorne grumbled, his burly frame seeming to suck the air out of the immaculate room. He was a man of simple tastes and simpler crimes, robberies, muggings, disputes that ended badly. This was not his world. The apartment, with its minimalist furniture, abstract art, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelf filled with musical scores, felt alien to him. Looks like something out of a damn movie. Detective Rossi, by contrast, moved through the space with a quiet, almost reverent grace. Izzy, as she was known to everyone but the brass, was Thorne's opposite in almost every way. Where he saw theatrics, she saw language. Where he saw a mess, she saw a message. Her eyes, a sharp, intelligent hazel, missed nothing. She ran a gloved finger along a row of leather-bound biographies. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, the titans of the craft. Her own past was steeped in this world. A promising concert pianist in her youth, she had traded the conservatory for the police academy after a family tragedy. But the music had never truly left her. It was a part of her analytical framework, a lens through which she viewed the chaos of human nature. He was killed somewhere between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., according to the Emmys preliminary, Izzy said softly, her gaze fixed on the victim. He attended the Crestwood Philharmonic's gala performance tonight. It ended around 10:30. The Symphony of 1,000 Stars, or whatever the hell it was called, Thorne grunted, flipping open his notepad. So, the killer could have been a guest he brought home, or someone who followed him. He looked around the pristine apartment. No signs of forced entry. The security on this building is tighter than a drum. Finch knew his killer. Invited them in. Izzy nodded, her attention drifting to the grand piano that dominated the living room. It was a magnificent Fazioli, its polished ebony surface reflecting the flashing blue and red lights from the street below. Atop the closed lid, a single sheet of manuscript paper was placed, held down by a crystal paperweight. It was the only object in the room that seemed out of place, not part of the carefully curated decor. She walked over, her footsteps muffled by the plush rug. Thorne followed, peering over her shoulder. On the paper, written in a stark, elegant calligraphy with jet-black ink, was a single bar of music. It was a short, haunting phrase, composed of just 5 notes. "What do you make of that?" Thorne asked. "A signature?" Izzy studied the notes, a faint flicker of recognition in her mind. Her fingers twitched, instinctively knowing how the phrase would feel under her hands on the ivory keys. "It's unusual," she murmured. "The clef is alto, which is less common for piano composition. The notes themselves, they're dissonant, unsettling. They don't resolve. It feels like a question without an answer." "A musical threat," Thorne surmised. "Maybe from a musician he trashed in one of his reviews." "That would be a list long enough to fill the concert hall," Izzy replied. a wry smile touching her lips. Finch was known for his brutal honesty. He called the Philharmonic's lead violinist a screeching cat in a wind tunnel last season. The investigation began to move in predictable, plodding circles. They pulled Finch's recent columns, flagging every musician, composer, and conductor he had criticized. The list was, as Izzy predicted, immense. They interviewed the building's doorman, who confirmed Finch had come home alone. No one saw or heard anything. The killer was a ghost. As the days turned into a week, the case grew colder. The press had a field day with the Symphony of Silence murder, as they dubbed it. The single bar of music was splashed across every front page, a cryptic taunt from a killer who seemed as sophisticated as he was savage. Izzy couldn't shake the melody. She'd copied it down and spent her evenings at her own worn upright piano, playing the 5 notes over and over. They hung in the air of her small apartment, a fragment of a larger, more sinister composition she couldn't yet hear. She cross-referenced the phrase with databases of classical and contemporary music, but found no match. It was an original composition, a killer's calling card. One name that appeared on their list, as it did in every major musical event in the city, was Maestro Serafina Volkov. She was the conductor of the Crestwood Philharmonic, a prodigy who had taken the classical music world by storm. At only 34, she was a phenomenona whirlwind of passion and precision on the podium. Russian-born, with high, sharp cheekbones, piercing ice-blue eyes, and a cascade of dark hair she often tied back in a severe bun, she commanded her orchestra with an almost terrifying intensity. Her concerts were legendary, not just for their technical perfection, but for their raw, emotional power. She didn't just conduct music. She seemed to channel it from some primal, unseen source. Finch, unlike many of his peers, had been a vocal admirer of Volkov. His review of the gala performance on the night of his murder had been glowing. Maestro Volkov did not merely conduct tonight. He had written in the draft found on his laptop. She wrestled with the very soul of the music and emerged victorious. She is not a conductor. She is a conduit for the sublime. Despite the positive review, protocol demanded an interview. Izzy and Thorne found themselves backstage at the magnificent Crestwood Concert Hall, a building that was a cathedral to sound. The air buzzed with the controlled chaos of musicians warming up, the cacophony of strings, brass, and woodwinds slowly coalescing into a unified hum. They were led to the conductor's private studio, a surprisingly Spartan room with a piano, a desk buried under musical scores, and a wall of windows overlooking the city. Serafina Volkov stood with her back to them, looking out at the skyline. She was tall and slender, dressed in a simple black turtleneck and trousers, a stark silhouette against the gray afternoon light. "Detectives," she said, her voice a low, melodic contralto with the faintest trace of a Russian accent. She turned, and her eyes, as blue and cold as a glacial crevasse, swept over them. They held an unnerving stillness, an intelligence that seemed to dissect and analyze them in an instant. "Maestro Volkov, thank you for your time," Thorne began, his gruff voice sounding abrasive in the quiet room. "We're here about Albert Finch." "A tragedy," Serafina said, her expression unreadable. She gestured for them to sit, though she remained standing, a subtle assertion of dominance. Albert was a rare thing, a critic with an actual understanding of the art form. His absence will be felt. "You knew him well?" Izzy asked, taking the lead. "We were not friends, detective. We were necessary adversaries who, on occasion, found ourselves in agreement. He was a fixture in my audience. We spoke at galas, the usual professional dance." Her gaze lingered on Izzy, a flicker of something curiosity, perhaps in their depths. "He wrote a very positive review of your performance on the night he was killed," Thorne pointed out. "Seems you were one of the few people in this town he wasn't feuding with." A ghost of a smile touched Serafina's lips. "My music does not invite feud, detective. It demands surrender." Albert understood that. Izzy decided to take a more direct approach. She pulled out a copy of the musical phrase found at the crime scene and placed it on the desk. "Maestro, have you ever seen this before?" Serafina picked up the paper, her long, elegant fingers holding it with a delicate precision. She studied the notes for a long moment, her head tilted. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant, muted sounds of the orchestra tuning. "It's a dark little phrase, isn't it?" she said finally, her voice soft. "It hangs in the air, unresolved. Like a question, as you have no doubt concluded." She looked directly at Izzy. "The composer uses a C-sharp against a D natural in the bass clef, a classic tritone. Diabolus in musica, the devil in music. An interval once banned by the church for being too unsettling. Whoever wrote this knows their theory. They're communicating a sense of profound, deliberate unease." "But you haven't seen it before?" Izzy pressed. "No, Detective Rossi. It is not familiar to me as a piece of established repertoire," Serafina replied, placing the paper back on the desk. "It seems to be an original fragment, a very personal statement." She turned her gaze back to the window. "Music is a language, detectives. Can express joy, sorrow, love, and, of course, hatred. You are looking for a killer who speaks this language fluently. I would suggest you look not just at those Albert criticized, but at those who are obsessed with the art itself. The line between passion and pathology can be very thin." The interview was a dead end. Serafina's alibi was ironclad. She had been at a post-concert reception with 200 other people until well after midnight. Her assessment of the musical clue was brilliant but offered them nothing new. Yet, as they left the concert hall and stepped back into the drizzling rain, Izzy couldn't shake a feeling of disquiet. It was the way Serafina had looked at the music, not with the surprise of a stranger, but with the appraising eye of a master studying an apprentice's work. There was an intellectual coldness in her analysis, a complete detachment from the brutal murder it represented. Over the next 2 weeks, the case stalled completely. The Symphony of Silence killer remained a phantom. The city's musical community was rife with fear and morbid speculation. Concert attendance surged as people flocked to the Philharmonic, hoping to catch a glimpse of the world where this arcane drama was unfolding. And at the center of it all was Serafina Volkov. Izzy found herself drawn to the conductor's performances. She attended 2 more concerts, not as a detective, but as a member of the audience, sitting in the back of the hall, letting the music wash over her. Watching Serafina on the podium was mesmerizing. She was a figure of absolute control, her body a live wire channeling the electricity of the orchestra. Every sweep of her baton, every subtle gesture of her hand, seemed to conjure sound from thin air. She conducted with her eyes closed much of the time, as if the score was imprinted on the inside of her eyelids, or perhaps on her very soul. The music she produced was breathtakingly beautiful, but underneath the soaring melodies and complex harmonies, Izzy began to hear something else. In the most thunderous crescendos and the most delicate pianissimos, she heard a thread of profound, chilling sorrow, a darkness that felt less like artistic interpretation and more like a confession. It was during a performance of Mahler's Symphony No. 6, often called the tragic, that a new piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The symphony is famous for its 3 hammer blows of fate, moments in the final movement where the composer calls for a large wooden hammer to strike a resonant box, signifying cruel twists of destiny. As Serafina conducted, her body taut with energy, she brought the orchestra to the first hammer blow. The sound exploded through the hall, a percussive shockwave that made the audience jump. At that exact moment, Izzy's phone buzzed in her pocket with a priority alert from the department. She ignored it, transfixed by the performance. The second hammer blow struck, even more powerful and devastating than the first. Again, her phone buzzed. A cold dread began to creep up her spine. She finally looked down at the screen. The message was from Thorne. "We've got another one. Get to the old opera house on 12th Street. You're not going to believe this." Izzy left the concert hall as the symphony reached its catastrophic finale. The sounds of Mahler's tragic fate followed her out into the night, a fitting score for the new horror that awaited her. The old opera house was a derelict giant, a crumbling testament to a bygone era. The crime scene was on the main stage, under the ghostly glow of a single, bare work light. The victim was a young woman, a gifted cellist named Anya Petrova. She lay on the dusty floorboards, her arms spread wide, her expensive cello smashed to pieces beside her. A single red rose was placed over her heart, and, like Finch, her throat was cut with a horrifying precision. She was reported missing by her roommate this afternoon, Thorne said, his voice low and grim. Didn't come home last night. Izzy's eyes scanned the scene, her mind racing. Anya Petrova. The name was familiar. She'd been the principal cellist for the Crestwood Philharmonic. Had been. Izzy remembered reading a small article a month ago. Petrova had been publicly and unceremoniously dismissed by Maestro Volkov for artistic inconsistencies. It had been a minor scandal, a testament to Volkov's infamous perfectionism. Then she saw it. Propped against the shattered remains of the cello was a familiar sheet of manuscript paper, held in place by a rosin block. On it, another single bar of music, written in the same elegant, black-inked hand. 5 more notes. Izzy pulled out the photo of the first musical phrase from her phone, holding it next to the new one. They were different, yet clearly written by the same person. This new phrase was lower, more melancholic. The killer is composing something? Izzy breathed, the horrific realization dawning on her. A piece of music. Every victim is a new bar in the score. Thorne looked from the dead woman to Izzy's pale face. A death symphony, he said, the words hanging like a shroud in the cavernous, silent theater. My God! Izzy's thoughts flew back to the concert hall, to the conductor on the podium, her eyes closed, lost in a world of her own making, to the hammer blows of fate, striking in perfect, horrifying synchronicity with the discovery of this new tragedy. It was impossible. It was a coincidence. But Detective Isabella Rossi had stopped believing in coincidences long ago. She was no longer just investigating a series of murders. She was listening to a composition, and she had a terrifying feeling she knew who the composer was. The overture was over. The main performance had just begun. The discovery of Anya Petrova's body sent a shockwave of terror through Crestwood that dwarfed the initial fear following Albert Finch's murder. One dead critic could be an act of revenge. 2 meticulously staged killings, linked by a bizarre musical signature, was the work of a serial killer. The media frenzy intensified, christening the phantom assailant the Maestro. The city was gripped by a mixture of fear and a strange, morbid fascination. The killer wasn't just brutal. They were an artist, and their canvas was the city's elite cultural scene. For Detectives Rossi and Thorne, the second murder transformed the investigation from a complex puzzle into a frantic race against a ticking clock. The 2 bars of music were now their most important and most enigmatic pieces of evidence. Izzy spent a sleepless night in her apartment with the 2 musical phrases laid out side by side on her piano. The first, from the Finch scene, was a question sharp, dissonant, and hanging in the air. The second, from the Petrova scene, felt like a somber, mournful answer. When she played them together, they formed a 10-note melody that was deeply unsettling. It was structured, yet it defied all traditional rules of harmony. It was the musical equivalent of a scream trapped behind a wall of glass. It's a leitmotif, she explained to Thorne the next morning in the bustling incident room. A whiteboard behind her covered in crime scene photos and connecting lines. It's a recurring musical theme that represents a person, place, or an idea. Wagner was famous for it. Think of the 2 notes for the shark in Jaws. This is the killer's theme. Thorne, ever the pragmatist, was more focused on the tangible connections. Forget the fancy music terms. Izzy, let's talk facts. Fact 1. Finch writes a glowing review of Maestro Volkov. Fact 2. Volkov fires Anya Petrova. Fact 3. Both Finch and Petrova end up dead, staged like a high school drama production. The Maestro is the only common denominator. It's too perfect, Marcus, Izzy countered, though she shared his suspicion. She's the most famous conductor in the country. Her life is a public record. Her alibi for the Finch murder is airtight, hundreds of witnesses. We need to find her alibi for last night. That alibi, they soon discovered, was just as solid. After the concert, the very one Izzy had attended, Serafina Volkov, had gone directly to a fundraising dinner with the city's mayor and a dozen other local dignitaries. She hadn't left until after 2 a.m., long after the medical examiner placed Petrova's time of death. She was surrounded by the most powerful people in the city. "She's either innocent, or she's the cleverest damn killer I've ever seen," Thorne grumbled, tossing the witness list onto his desk. "Maybe she has an accomplice. A devoted fan. A fan who kills for her? A cellist she fired and a critic who adored her." Izzy shook her head. "The victims don't fit that narrative. Finch was an asset to her. Petrova was a problem she had already solved by firing her. The motive is missing. The motive, Izzy suspected, was hidden in the music." The investigation branched into two parallel paths. Thorne and his team dug deep into Serafina Volkov's life, searching for any crack in her pristine facade. They re-interviewed musicians from the orchestra, board members, and staff at the concert hall. The picture they painted was consistent and frustrating. Volkov was a genius, but a tyrannical one. She was demanding, aloof, and utterly obsessed with perfection. She had few friends and no known romantic partners. Her entire existence revolved around the orchestra. Many disliked her personally, but no one could deny her talent. They found dozens of people who had been professionally wounded by her, musicians demoted, composers whose work she dismissed, guest soloists she'd humiliated, but no one who could be plausibly linked to two savage murders. Meanwhile, Izzy immersed herself in Serafina's world, her music. She obtained recordings of all of Volkov's concerts and a collection of her few original compositions. She spent hours listening, score sheets spread across her floor, searching for the killer's 10-note theme. She found nothing. Volkov's music was complex and often dark, filled with towering, dramatic passages and moments of aching vulnerability. But the killer's melody, that specific sequence of ugly, dissonant notes, was nowhere to be found. It was as if it belonged to a different composer entirely. Frustrated, Izzy shifted her focus. If the theme wasn't in Serafina's music, perhaps it related to it in some other way. She began to research musical theory, cryptography, and the history of composers who used ciphers in their work, like Bach and Schumann. She fell down a rabbit hole of arcane knowledge, learning about musical anagrams and inverted melodies. It was during this deep dive that she stumbled upon an obscure musicological concept, the shadow melody. It was a theoretical idea that a melody could be deconstructed and its opposite, or shadow, could be created by inverting the intervals and reversing the rhythm. It was a complex, almost mathematical exercise, more of a thought experiment than a common compositional tool. Driven by a hunch, Izzy returned to Serafina's most famous original work, a powerful, brooding symphony she had composed 5 years prior, titled Echoes of a Fractured Soul. The symphony was celebrated for its haunting main theme, a simple, beautiful melody that recurred throughout the piece. Izzy isolated that theme, a 16-note phrase. With a pencil, a score sheet, and a growing sense of dread, she began to deconstruct it. She took Serafina's beautiful melody and started applying the shadow principles. She inverted each interval. A rise of a third became a fall of a third. She reversed the rhythmic values. The process was painstaking and mechanical. After an hour, she had a new, grotesque melody scrawled on the page. She took it to her piano. Her hands trembled slightly as she positioned her fingers over the keys. She played the new sequence. The sound that filled her apartment was jarring, ugly, and chillingly familiar. It was the killer's theme. The 10 notes from the 2 crime scenes were the first 10 notes of the shadow melody she had just created. Izzy sat back, stunned, a cold sweat on her brow. This was it. The proof. The killer not only knew Serafina Volkov's work, they were systematically desecrating it. They were taking her most celebrated melody, a piece lauded for its beauty, and twisting it into a theme of death and chaos. It was an act of profound intimacy and violation. This new evidence was enough to secure a second interview with the maestro. They met her again in her studio at the concert hall, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. She was in the middle of studying a score, a baton held loosely in her hand, tapping a silent, complex rhythm against her palm. "Detectives," she said, looking up, her blue eyes betraying no surprise. "To what do I owe the encore?" Izzy didn't waste time with pleasantries. She laid out the 2 crime scene musical phrases on the desk, followed by the score for Echoes of a Fractured Soul. And finally, her own handwritten page showing the inverted shadow melody. "Maestro Volkov, we've identified the killer's musical theme," Izzy stated, her voice steady. "What we can't figure out is why it appears to be a desecration of your own work. It's an inversion of the main theme from your most famous symphony. An ugly, twisted version of it. Can you explain that?" Serafina looked down at the papers on her desk. She examined Izzy's transcription, her expression a blank mask of professional curiosity. She traced the notes with her finger, her lips moving silently. If she was shocked or afraid, she gave no sign. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across her face. It was not a smile of warmth, but of intellectual satisfaction, like a grandmaster admiring a worthy opponent's move. "Detective Rossi," she said, her voice dripping with something that sounded almost like admiration. "You have done your homework. Your theory on melodic inversion is impressive. Most impressive. So you recognize it?" Thorne pressed, leaning forward. "I recognize the principle behind it," Serafina corrected smoothly. "To take something beautiful and systematically corrupt it into its opposite. It is an act of profound psychological aggression, a statement of intellectual dominance." She looked back at Izzy. "This killer is not just murdering people. They are attacking me. They are attacking my art, my soul. They are taking what is mine and turning it into a monument to their own sickness." Her performance was masterful. She was the victim, a genius artist being terrorized by a deranged phantom who understood her work intimately enough to defile it. She positioned herself not as a suspect, but as the central target of the killer's obsession. She even offered to help. "This changes things," she said, her tone now grave. "If my music is the key, then I must assist you. I can analyze the melodic fragments, perhaps predict the killer's next compositional step. You are dealing with a mind that thinks in terms of musical structure. I can be your translator." Thorne was visibly skeptical, but Izzy saw the trap being laid. By offering to join the investigation, Serafina could gain access to their evidence, monitor their progress, and potentially lead them astray. But denying her help would seem illogical if they truly believed she was the target. They were caught in her web. The weeks that followed were a surreal cat-and-mouse game. Serafina would meet with Izzy, offering brilliant but ultimately useless insights into the killer's musical psyche. She would talk about harmonic progression and thematic development, her language a mesmerizing blend of artistic passion and cold analysis. She pointed them toward disgruntled students and rival composers from her past, all of whom proved to be dead ends after exhaustive investigation. All the while, she was studying Izzy, gauging her reactions, learning how she thought. Izzy played along, feeding the maestro tidbits of information while holding her most critical thoughts back. She felt like she was in a chess match where every move was fraught with hidden meaning. During their sessions, Izzy steered the conversation toward Serafina's past, probing for any hint of the darkness she now knew resided within her. She learned of Serafina's childhood in a brutalist Soviet-era conservatory, a place that forged prodigies through relentless, unforgiving discipline. Her parents were both celebrated musicians who saw her not as a daughter, but as a legacy. She spoke of her mentor, a fearsome old professor who taught her that music was not an art, but a war against imperfection. "He used to say that a wrong note was not a mistake," Serafina told Izzy one afternoon, her eyes distant. "It was a moral failure, a lie. He believed that perfect music was the only truth in a world of chaos. To create that truth, any price was worth paying. Any sacrifice was justified. Even sacrificing people?" Izzy asked quietly. Serafina's gaze snapped back to her, sharp and piercing. "The music is all that matters, detective. The performance. Everything else is just noise." The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. While Thorne's team continued to hit brick walls with Serafina's life in Crestwood, a junior detective, on a hunch, started digging into her early years in Russia before she had emigrated. It was difficult. Records were sealed or had been lost, but he finally found a thread. A police report from St. Petersburg, 20 years old. It detailed the disappearance of a young violin prodigy named Mikhail Orlov. Orlov had been Serafina's chief rival at the conservatory. They were the two brightest stars, pitted against each other from a young age. The report stated that Orlov had vanished without a trace just a week before the prestigious Tchaikovsky competition, an event he was heavily favored to win. With him gone, Serafina Volkov had won the competition, a victory that launched her international career. His case was never solved. He was presumed to be a runaway or a defector. When Izzy saw the report, the final, terrible piece of the puzzle slid into place. She thought back to something Serafina had said. The line between passion and pathology can be very thin. And her mentor's words, any sacrifice was justified. She now believed there was a third victim, a ghost from 20 years ago. The killings hadn't started with Albert Finch. They had started with a boy who stood in the way of greatness. Izzy realized Serafina wasn't just killing people who annoyed her. She was eliminating dissonant notes from her life's composition. Mikhail Orlov was the first. Anya Petrova, the cellist whose artistic inconsistencies were an intolerable flaw in the perfection of her orchestra, was another. And Albert Finch? His murder was the most brilliant move of all. He wasn't a dissonant note. He was the opposite. He was a source of effusive praise. By killing her most vocal supporter, she threw suspicion off herself completely. It was a calculated, audacious act of misdirection. He was a sacrifice to protect the composer. The murders were not acts of rage. They were acts of curation, of editing. Serafina Volkov was not just a conductor. She was the composer, conductor, and editor of her own perfect, sociopathic reality. But they still had no hard evidence. No DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon. All they had was a psychological profile, a 20-year-old cold case, and a series of terrifyingly clever musical clues. They knew who the killer was, but they couldn't prove it. And then they learned that the Crestwood Philharmonic was just 3 days away from the world premiere of Serafina Volkov's new, Major Symphony. It was the most anticipated musical event of the year. The title of the symphony was Requiem for the Fallen. Izzy's blood ran cold. A requiem is a mass for the dead. She's not finished, Izzy said to Thorne, her voice grim. The composition isn't complete. There's another movement, another murder. The premiere? Thorne breathed, the color draining from his face. She's going to do it at the premiere. They now knew the when and the where. The only remaining question was who. Who was the final dissonant note that needed to be silenced to complete Serafina's terrible masterpiece? They had 72 hours to figure it out, or the maestro's Sinister Symphony would reach its horrifying, bloody finale in front of a sold-out audience. The crescendo was building, and the entire city was about to become a concert hall for a killer. The 72 hours leading up to the premiere of Requiem for the Fallen were the most frantic and desperate of the investigation. The Crestwood Police Department, led by a grimly determined Rossi and Thorne, threw everything they had at Serafina Volkov. They put her under 24/7 surveillance, a discreet but constant presence. They obtained warrants to search her apartment and her studio at the concert hall. Both locations were as Spartan and impeccably organized as the woman herself. They found no weapons, no forensic links, not a single incriminating piece of paper. Her digital life was equally sterile. Her emails were purely professional, and her computer's hard drive contained nothing but musical scores and correspondence with her agent. She was a ghost in her own life, leaving no traces. Izzy knew they were looking for the wrong thing. The evidence wasn't in the physical world. It was in the music. She and a small, trusted team of musically literate officers spent nearly 2 days poring over every note of the score for the new Requiem, which the department had obtained via a court order. It was a monumental and deeply disturbing work, filled with passages of breathtaking beauty that would collapse into moments of shocking, violent dissonance. It was a musical map of a fractured, brilliant mind. "She's telling us how she did it," Izzy murmured, tracing a line of music in the second movement. "This section here is chaotic. The cellos are playing this frantic, screeching passage. It's meant to sound like an instrument being destroyed." It was the musical representation of Anya Petrova's murder. Another section in the first movement contained a solo for the English horn, a mournful, questioning phrase that was abruptly silenced by a blast from the brass section. Albert Finch, the critic whose voice had been permanently silenced. The symphony was a confession, written in a language only she and, now, Izzy could fully understand. But it wasn't proof. In court, it was just art open to interpretation. They needed to know what the finale meant. The fourth and final movement was titled Apotheosis in Silence. It was the most complex part of the score, building to a colossal, terrifying climax for the full orchestra, which then suddenly cut off, leaving a single violin to play a soft, heartbreakingly beautiful solo that slowly faded into nothing. "Apotheosis," Izzy said, looking at Thorne. "It means the elevation of someone to divine status." And then, silence. "The final murder," Thorne stated, his jaw tight. "It's the violinist, the concertmaster. He's the target." The concertmaster of the Crestwood Philharmonic was a man named Julian Croft. He was a brilliant, fiery musician who had a notoriously contentious relationship with Serafina. They were professionals, but sources inside the orchestra spoke of bitter arguments over artistic interpretation, of a constant, simmering power struggle between the conductor on the podium and the lead violinist. Croft was the only person in the orchestra who dared to challenge her. He was the final dissonant note. The night of the premiere arrived, cloaked in an atmosphere of unparalleled tension. The concert hall was surrounded by a discreet but heavy police presence. Inside, every seat was filled. The audience was a mix of the city's elite, genuine music lovers, and morbidly curious thrill-seekers, all buzzing with the knowledge that the woman on the podium was the primary suspect in the Maestro killings. The air crackled with anticipation and fear. Backstage, Izzy and Thorne briefed a team of SWAT officers. Their plan was to let the concert begin but to extract Julian Croft from the stage moments before the fourth movement began. It was a risky strategy, but they had no legal grounds to cancel the performance, and they hoped to catch Serafina in the act of whatever she had planned. Izzy found a position in the wings of the stage, hidden from the audience, where she could see both Serafina and the orchestra. Thorne was in the control booth with live feeds from every camera in the hall. As the house lights dimmed, a hush fell over the massive auditorium. Serafina Volkov walked onto the stage. She was greeted by a wave of tense, uncertain applause. She looked magnificent, dressed in a severe, custom-tailored black gown that seemed to absorb the light around her. She gave a curt, formal bow to the audience, then turned to her orchestra. For a moment, her ice-blue eyes swept across her musicians, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was a smile of utter triumph. Then she raised her baton. The first three movements of the Requiem for the Fallen were a harrowing, emotional journey. Serafina conducted with a demonic energy Izzy had never seen before. She was not just leading the music, she was living it. Her body convulsed with the violent passages, and she seemed to shrink into herself during the moments of sorrow. She was telling the story of her crimes, reliving each murder through the power of sound, and forcing 2,000 people to bear witness. Izzy watched, her heart pounding, feeling like a voyeur to a killer's private ritual. She saw Julian Croft, the concertmaster, playing with intense focus, sweat beading on his brow, completely unaware that he was the intended star of the grand finale. As the third movement ended, Izzy tensed, preparing to give the signal to move in. But something was wrong. Serafina did not lower her baton. There was no pause between movements. With a furious, sharp gesture, she launched the orchestra directly into the fourth movement, Apotheosis in Silence. Panic surged through Izzy. "She's not stopping. She's playing it through," she hissed into her radio. "Hold your positions," Thorne's voice crackled back. "Wait for the climax. We can't cause a panic." The music swelled, a tidal wave of sound that engulfed the hall. The orchestra played with a frantic, desperate energy, driven by their conductor's madness. The climax was approaching, the moment the score indicated the full orchestra would cut out, leaving the solo violin. Izzy watched Julian Croft, her hand on her weapon. The SWAT team began to creep closer to the stage doors. The crescendo reached an almost unbearable peak. The brass screamed. The percussion thundered like cannon fire. Serafina's eyes were closed, a look of ecstatic rapture on her face. This was her moment of creation, her apotheosis. But as the final, crashing chord was meant to strike, Serafina did something no one expected. Her eyes snapped open. In a single, fluid motion, she spun around, not to the orchestra, but to face the audience. The orchestra, following their score, went silent on the downbeat. And in that sudden, shocking silence, Serafina raised her right hand. It was no longer holding the baton. It was holding a small, silenced pistol, which had been concealed in the sleeve of her gown. She did not point it at Julian Croft. She pointed it directly at the conductor's podium. Before anyone could react, she fired a single shot into a small, almost invisible device strapped to the base of the podium. There was a soft pop, and a clear, odorless gas began to hiss out, enveloping her. Izzy finally understood. The apotheosis in silence wasn't about Julian Croft. It was about her. The final victim, the ultimate sacrifice to complete her masterpiece, was herself. She was elevating her own legend from genius conductor to mythical, martyred artist, dying at the climax of her own requiem. Her death would be the final, silent note, leaving a mystery that would be debated for centuries. Gas! It's a suicide! Izzy screamed into the radio as she burst from the wings, other officers converging from all sides. Chaos erupted in the concert hall as the audience began to scream and scramble for the exits. Serafina smiled, a serene, beatific expression on her face as she inhaled the poison. She raised her arms as if to embrace the sound of the panic, the final, perfect cacophony she had composed. But Thorne had anticipated the unexpected. He had not only studied the score, but the schematics of the concert hall. On a hunch, he had ordered the hall's emergency ventilation system, designed to clear smoke in a fire, to be put on standby. The moment he saw the gun, he gave the order. "Purge the stage!" he roared over the comms. With a loud whir, massive vents in the stage floor and ceiling kicked into life, sucking the poison gas out and away from Serafina with incredible force. Her eyes widened in shock and fury as the clean air washed over her. Her perfect, silent death was being stolen from her. Izzy reached her as she began to sway, the fast-acting poison still having some effect. The conductor's legs buckled, and she collapsed. The last thing she saw before she lost consciousness was Detective Rossi's face, a picture of grim, sorrowful understanding. Serafina Volkov awoke in the sterile white room of a hospital prison ward. The first thing she saw was Izzy, sitting in a chair by her bed. The maestro was weak, but the fire in her glacial eyes was undimmed. It now burned with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You ruined it," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper. "It was a perfect ending. My legacy. You're a killer, not a martyr," Izzy said calmly. "Talk to me, Serafina. Tell me about Mikhail Orlov." And so the dam broke. With nothing left to lose, her masterpiece spoiled, Serafina confessed. She spoke for hours, not with remorse, but with chilling intellectual pride. Her voice, though weak, was filled with an artist's passion as she detailed her compositions. "Mikhail," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, "was a flaw, a brilliant technician, but he had no soul. He played the notes, but he didn't understand the music. His victory at the competition would have been a lie, a perversion of the art. I simply edited him, a correction to the score. And Anya Petrova? A screeching, imprecise child. Her vibrato was a disgrace. Every time she played, she was a splinter in the perfection of my orchestra. I gave her warnings. She did not listen. She had to be silenced. Her death, the splintering of her instrument. It was a more honest sound than any she ever made in life. "What about Finch?" Izzy asked. "He adored you. He understood you." A flicker of something that might have been regret crossed Serafina's face. "Albert. He was a necessary sacrifice. A grace note. My genius needed a puzzle to surround it, a mystery to elevate it beyond simple crime. His murder made me the central theme of the story, the object of obsession, rather than the obvious culprit. It was my most clever piece of orchestration." She explained how she had committed the murders herself, using the chaos of post-concert crowds and her intimate knowledge of the city's hidden passages to move unseen. She was a ghost, a phantom, moving between the worlds of high art and brutal violence. Her alibis were a fortress of her own design. Her confession was the final, horrifying movement of her symphony. She was arrested, and the trial was a media sensation. Serafina Volkov, the maestro, was unmasked as a monster, a woman whose obsession with perfection had warped into a justification for murder. She saw people not as human beings, but as notes in her personal composition. Some were harmonious and beautiful, others were dissonant, and the dissonant notes, she believed, had to be erased. Months later, the city of Crestwood was still healing. The concert hall had reopened, but a shadow hung over it. The Requiem for the Fallen was never performed again, its score locked away as a piece of evidence. One rainy evening, Detective Isabella Rossi sat at her own piano. She had a copy of Serafina's confession on the stand in front of her. She thought of the woman who could create such sublime beauty and such profound horror. She thought about the fine, terrifying line between genius and madness. Slowly, she placed her fingers on the keys and began to play the main theme from Echoes of a Fractured Soul. The beautiful, haunting melody filled the small apartment. It was a melody of profound sadness, a confession that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Izzy played it through to the end, and when the final note faded, she was left with nothing but the sound of the rain against her window and a deep, chilling silence. The symphony was finally over.